The first time Dr. Elena Vasquez saw the Kitharan cubs, they were dying. The research station's medical bay buzzed with frantic activity as xenobiologists and military medics worked side by side, their usual territorial disputes forgotten in the face of tragedy. 3 small forms lay on the examination tables, their golden fur matted with a strange blue substance that seemed to eat away at their flesh wherever it touched. Elena pressed herself against the observation window, her breath fogging the reinforced glass. She wasn't supposed to be here. As the station's cultural anthropologist, she had no business in the medical wing during a biological emergency. But something about the desperate chittering sounds coming from the isolation chamber had drawn her like a moth to flame. "They're not responding to any treatment," Dr. Harrison muttered to his assistant, unaware that Elena was listening. "The toxin is unlike anything in our database. At this rate, we'll lose all 3 within the hour." Elena's heart clenched. She had been studying Kitharan culture for 2 years, ever since first contact had been established with their proud warrior species. The cubs couldn't be more than juveniles, their characteristic battle scars not yet earned, their ceremonial braids still short and sparse. The Kitharans were a paradox that had fascinated Elena from the beginning, a species that valued honor above life, courage above comfort, and yet showed such tender care for their young that entire clans would go to war over a single cub's welfare. They stood nearly 8 feet tall when fully grown, with powerful haunches, retractable claws, and faces that combined the nobility of lions with the intelligence of humans. "Dr. Vasquez," a voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Commander Torres, the station's military leader, approaching with heavy steps. His usually stern face showed an unusual vulnerability. "Commander, I know what you were doing," he said quietly, "and I need your help." Elena blinked in surprise. In the 2 years she'd been stationed here, Torres had barely acknowledged her existence, dismissing her research as soft science compared to the military's strategic concerns. "The Cub's guardian is here," Torres continued, nodding toward the corridor behind him. "Warrior Prime Jector, he's demanding to see them, but our protocols." "Protocols?" Elena's voice rose sharper than she intended. "Commander, in Kitharan culture, preventing a guardian from reaching their cubs during a medical crisis isn't just insulting, it's considered a form of torture." Tor's jaw tightened. "The contamination risk is something we'll have to manage," Elena said firmly. "Because if Jector believes we're deliberately keeping him from those cubs, there won't be a diplomatic relationship left to salvage." She had met Jector several times during cultural exchanges. He was typical of his species in many ways, towering, imposing, with scars that told stories of battles won and honor earned. But Elena had noticed something else about him, something that set him apart from other Kitharan warriors she'd encountered. When he looked at the cubs under his protection, his fierce golden eyes softened with a tenderness that transcended species. "There's something else," Torres said, lowering his voice. "The toxin they were exposed to, it wasn't an accident." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean?" "We found traces of the same substance in 3 different locations around the station's perimeter. Someone deliberately placed it where the cubs would find it during their evening hunt." The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. Someone on this station, human or otherwise, had tried to murder 3 innocent cubs. The political ramifications alone could destroy the fragile peace between their species, but beyond that was something more personal that made Elena's hands clench into fists. She had watched these cubs grow over the past 6 months, had documented their play, their learning, their gradual integration into Kitharan society. They weren't just research subjects to her anymore, they were children. "I need to speak with Jector," she said. Torres nodded grimly. "I was hoping you'd say that. He's in conference room 3 and he's agitated." Elena could hear the warriors' roars echoing down the corridor before she reached the conference room. The sound was primal, heartbroken, a noise that spoke of rage and desperation in equal measure. When she activated the door controls, the roaring stopped abruptly. Jector stood with his back to her, his massive frame trembling with barely controlled emotion. His ceremonial armor bore fresh scratches where his claws had raked across the metal in anguish. "Warrior Prime," Elena said softly in his language, "I grieve with you." He turned, and Elena had to steel herself not to step backward. Jector's eyes blazed with fury, but beneath the anger she saw something that broke her heart: fear. Pure, helpless fear for the cubs he was sworn to protect. "Human friend Alina," he rumbled, his English carefully measured despite his emotional state. "They tell me I cannot see my cubs. They tell me. They tell me the little ones may not survive." Alina took a breath, knowing that her next words would either build a bridge or burn one forever. "They're wrong," she said simply. "You will see them, and we will find a way to save them." Alina's declaration hung in the air between them like a challenge to the universe itself. Jector's massive form went completely still, his predator instincts recognizing something in her tone that transcended mere sympathy. "You speak with certainty, human friend Alina," he said slowly, "but your healers have already admitted defeat." "Our healers don't understand what they're dealing with," Alina replied, her mind racing. "But I think I might." She had spent months documenting Kitharan medical practices, including their use of something they called spirit singing, a form of therapeutic communication that their traditional healers claimed could accelerate healing and boost immune responses. The human medical team had dismissed it as primitive superstition, but Alina had observed its effects firsthand during minor injuries among the adult Kitharans. "The blue substance on the cubs," Alina continued. "Did your people encounter anything like it before?" Jector's eyes narrowed. "You believe this is not a new poison?" "I believe someone used our own ignorance against us. Tell me about the bleeding shadows." The warrior's reaction was immediate and visceral. His claws extended involuntarily, scraping against the metal table. "How do you know that name?" Alina had found references to the bleeding shadows buried deep in Kitharan historical texts, a biological weapon used by their ancient enemies, the Velter, during the War of Screaming Moons over 3 centuries ago. The Kitharans had eventually developed a defense, but the knowledge had been lost to time, deemed unnecessary after the Velter extinction. "Because whoever poisoned those cubs knew exactly what they were doing," Alina said grimly. "They didn't just want to kill them, they wanted to send a message, make it look like our station was unsafe, that humanity couldn't protect Kitharan young." The political implications were staggering. If the cubs died while under human protection, it would validate every argument made by the Kitharan isolationist faction. The promising alliance between their species would crumble, and with it, humanity's best hope for surviving in a galaxy that seemed increasingly hostile to newcomers. But Alina wasn't thinking about politics. She was thinking about 3 small, brave cubs who had trusted humans enough to explore freely around the station, who had approached her with curious chittering whenever she sat in the garden with her research tablets. "The ancient cure," she pressed. "Surely some knowledge remains." Jector was quiet for a long moment, his massive frame casting shadows across the room. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of generations. "My grandmother's grandmother was a healer in the old times. She passed down songs, rituals. But they were considered obsolete after the great enemy fell. Most of our people have forgotten." "But not all." "Not all," he admitted. "But the healing requires trust, complete trust between healer and patient. The cubs are unconscious, their minds clouded by poison. They cannot give such trust." Alina felt pieces clicking together in her mind like a complex puzzle finding its solution. "But they could trust through you." Jector's golden eyes fixed on her with laser intensity. "Explain." "In your culture, guardians can act as conduits for unconscious cubs. You've told me stories about it. Warriors who sang wounded younglings back to health during battles, who shared their strength through bonds deeper than blood." "The deep singing," Jector whispered. "But it has not been attempted in over 100 years, and never with alien healers." Alina leaned forward, her voice urgent. "It doesn't matter if the healers are alien. What matters is that you trust them enough to let them work through you, and that means we need to prove we deserve that trust." She stood abruptly, her decision crystallizing. "I'm taking you to see those cubs right now. The contamination protocols are irrelevant if they're going to die anyway." Alina's voice carried a steel that surprised even her. "And I have a theory about that too." 20 minutes later, Alina stood in the medical bay's decontamination chamber alongside Jector, both of them sealed into biohazard suits. Dr. Harrison had protested, Commander Torres had threatened to have her arrested, but Alina had played the one card that trumped all others. If the cubs died while their guardian was kept away, the resulting diplomatic catastrophe would make the contamination risk seem trivial. Through the observation window, she could see the three cubs lying motionless on their biobeds. Their golden fur had turned dull, their breathing shallow and labored. The blue substance continued its slow, inexorable consumption of their tissue. "My theory," Alina said quietly as they waited for the decontamination cycle to complete, "is that the poison isn't just biological. It's designed to be psychologically devastating, too." Jector's suit-amplified voice was rough, meaning it gets worse when the victim feels abandoned or afraid. The Velter were psychological warriors as much as biological ones. They understood that sometimes the mind's surrender kills faster than any toxin. The decontamination cycle finished with a soft chime. Alina's heart hammered as the inner door cycled open, revealing the medical bay in all its sterile, clinical coldness. Jector took one step into the room and froze. Alina watched as the mighty warrior, who had faced down charging battle beasts and survived the trial of broken spears, began to tremble at the sight of three small, still forms. "They're so quiet," he whispered. Alina understood. Kitharan cubs were never quiet. They chattered, they played, they explored everything with boundless curiosity. The silence in this room was more terrifying than any roar. But then something remarkable happened. As Jector approached the nearest biobed, the cub's ears twitched. Its breathing, while still labored, seemed to deepen slightly. The monitors showed a subtle but unmistakable improvement in vital signs. "They know you're here," Alina breathed. Dr. Harrison, monitoring from outside the isolation chamber, spoke through the comm system. "Impossible. They're unconscious. Their brain activity is minimal." But Alina wasn't listening to Harrison. She was watching Jector's face transform as he reached out with one massive, gentle hand to stroke the first cub's head. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something she had almost given up on. Hope. The change in the cubs was subtle but undeniable. As Jector moved from bed to bed, gently stroking each small head with fingers that could crush steel yet touched with butterfly delicacy, their vital signs showed marked improvement. The blue toxins advance slowed, though it didn't stop. "Remarkable," Dr. Harrison's voice crackled through the comm. "I'm reading elevated endorphin production, increased white cell activity. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." But Alina could see the strain on Jector's face. The warrior was pouring every ounce of his emotional energy into reaching the cubs, and while it was helping, it wouldn't be enough. The poison was still winning. "We need to try the deep singing," she said quietly. Jector's hand stilled on the smallest cub's head. "You do not understand what you ask, human friend Alina. The deep singing requires the healer to open themselves completely, to share not just knowledge but essence itself. If it fails..." "If it fails, they die anyway," Alina finished. "But if we don't try, we're guaranteed to lose them." She paused, then added something that had been growing in her mind since she'd first heard of the ancient healing ritual. "And you won't be doing it alone." Jector turned to look at her through his biosuit visor. "The deep singing cannot be performed by humans. Your minds are structured differently, your emotional resonance." "Is exactly what we need," Alina interrupted. "Think about it. These cubs have been living among humans for months. They've learned to trust us, to see us as part of their extended pack. That connection goes both ways." She moved to stand beside him, her hand hovering over the same cub he had been touching. "I may not be able to sing to them the way you can, but I can anchor you. I can be the bridge between your healing and our medicine." Through the observation window, she could see Dr. Harrison frantically checking readings, probably convinced she'd lost her mind. Commander Torres stood beside him, his face grim but determined. Alina realized with a start that he was keeping the other medical staff from interfering. "Even if such a thing were possible," Jector said slowly, "you would be taking enormous risk. The deep singing can damage the mind of one unprepared for it, and we have never attempted it with another species." Alina looked down at the smallest cub, whose breathing had grown so shallow it was barely perceptible. She thought about the reports she'd filed, the cultural observations she'd documented, the careful academic distance she'd maintained between herself and her subjects. All of that felt meaningless now. "They're not just your cubs," she said softly. "Over the past months, they've become part of our community, too. Little Kekri brings me flowers from the hydroponics garden every Tuesday. Jalin always stops to watch when I'm writing in my journal like he's trying to understand human writing. And Yilter, She smiled despite the tears threatening to fall. Yilter once spent 3 hours trying to teach me how to properly pounce on a training dummy. She looked up at Jector, and in his golden eyes she saw recognition of the bond she described. If there's even a chance this could work, she continued, then I have to try, because they're children and children shouldn't die because adults failed them. Jector studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and placed his massive hand over hers. Very well, human friend Alina, we will attempt something that has never been tried. But you must promise me, if you feel your mind breaking under the strain, you will withdraw immediately. I will not have your death added to this tragedy. Alina nodded, though privately she doubted she'd be able to keep that promise if the cubs' lives hung in the balance. What do I need to do? Place your hands on Kekri, Jector instructed, indicating the smallest cub. Open your mind to whatever you feel coming from her. Do not analyze it, do not try to understand it. Simply let it flow through you. I will handle the actual healing songs. Alina gently placed her hands on either side of Kekri's small head. The cub's fur was soft but disturbingly warm, fever-hot from the poison coursing through her system. Close your eyes, Jector murmured. Let yourself feel what she feels. Alina had participated in meditation exercises before, but this was different. As she opened her mind, she began to sense something beyond normal perception, a small, bright presence that felt distinctly like Kekri. Playful but frightened, brave but confused, lost in a darkness that seemed to have no end. Then Jector began to sing. The sound was unlike anything Alina had ever heard. It wasn't quite music and wasn't quite language, but something that bridged both. The deep, resonant tones seemed to vibrate through her bones, through the air itself, creating harmonics that touched something deeper than hearing. And suddenly, Alina understood. The song wasn't just sound. It was emotion made manifest, love given voice, hope transformed into something tangible. She felt it flowing through her, around her, and most importantly, through her hands into the small, still form beneath them. But the poison fought back. Alina gasped as she felt it, a cold, hungry presence that seemed to whisper of despair and abandonment. This was the psychological component of the Welter weapon, the part designed to convince victims that resistance was futile, that they were alone and forgotten. The toxin's mental assault hit Alina like a physical blow, and for a moment she almost broke the connection. Images flashed through her mind. The cubs dying alone and afraid, Jector's grief destroying him, the alliance between their species crumbling into war and hatred. But then she felt something else, a warm, steady presence beside her own. Jector's song grew stronger, wrapping around both her and the cub like a protective shield. And through that shield, Alina felt the other cubs stirring, drawn by the sound of their guardian's voice calling them back from the darkness. She realized that she was no longer just a conduit. Somehow, impossibly, she had become part of the healing itself. The monitors in the room began to sing with new alarms, not warnings of crisis, but alerts of rapid improvement. The blue toxin's advance had not just stopped, it was beginning to retreat. The healing song reached a crescendo that Alina felt in every cell of her body. Through her hands, she could sense Kekri's life force growing stronger, the small cub's natural vitality reasserting itself against the alien poison. But the effort was enormous. Alina felt as though she was holding back an ocean with nothing but her bare hands. Then, without warning, the connection exploded outward. Suddenly, Alina wasn't just linked to Kekri, but to all three cubs simultaneously. Their fear, their pain, their desperate fight for survival flooded through her consciousness like a tidal wave. She cried out, her mental barriers nearly shattering under the assault of shared agony. But Jector's song anchored her, his deep voice weaving a pattern of strength and protection around their joined minds. Through the link, Alina began to understand something profound about Kitharan psychology. They weren't just individuals, but part of a collective consciousness that bound families, clans, and entire societies together. The cubs weren't dying alone. They were dying as a unit, their shared despair amplifying the poison's effects. But that same connection could work in reverse. Together, Alina gasped, her voice barely audible over the monitor's rapid beeping. They need to heal together. Jector's song shifted, becoming more complex, weaving multiple harmonies that seemed to address each cub individually while maintaining the overarching unity. Alina felt her role in the healing transform from passive conduit to active participant. Her human mind, with its different neural pathways and emotional structures, was providing something the traditional Kithaeron healing couldn't achieve alone, a bridge between the cub's collective consciousness and the individual medical treatments being administered. Through the observation window, Dr. Harrison's team worked frantically, adjusting medications and monitoring life signs as the cubs' bodies began responding in ways that defied their understanding of xenobiology. But Alina barely noticed. Her entire world had narrowed to the three small lives she could feel fighting their way back from the edge of oblivion. The smallest cub, Kekri, was the first to stir. Alina felt the moment of awakening like sunrise after the longest night, a gradual warming that spread from the cub's consciousness through the link to her guardian, to Alina herself, and finally to her two companions. Jekter's song gentled, becoming something closer to a lullaby, but he didn't stop. Alina understood why. The healing wasn't complete, it was just beginning. The toxin was retreating but slowly, and the cubs' bodies needed time to repair the damage already done. Alina, Dr. Harrison's voice cut through the comm system. Whatever you're doing, it's working, but I'm reading dangerous stress levels in your neural patterns. You need to break the connection. Alina tried to respond, but found her voice wouldn't obey. Speaking would mean shifting her attention away from the healing link, and she could feel how fragile it still was. The cubs were conscious now, their golden eyes open and aware, but they were looking at her with a trust so complete it took her breath away. They expected her to save them. More than that, they believed she already had. 5 more minutes, Jekter rumbled, his massive frame swaying slightly with exhaustion. The deep toxin retreats, but slowly. We must maintain the song until the last trace is gone. Alina nodded, though the movement sent spikes of pain through her skull. The human brain wasn't designed for this kind of psychic connection, and she could feel the strain building toward a dangerous crescendo. But every time she considered breaking the link, she saw Kekri's trusting eyes, felt Jalen's growing strength, sensed Yilter's determination to survive. They weren't just patients anymore, they were family. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Somewhere during the past months of observation and documentation, these cubs had claimed a piece of her heart. They represented something she hadn't even known she was looking for, the possibility that humanity might find a place in this vast galaxy not as conquerors or explorers, but as protectors of something precious and innocent. The toxin made its final retreat with what Alina could only describe as a shriek of frustrated malice. The blue substance dissolved from the cub's fur like ice melting in sunlight, leaving behind healthy golden coats and alert, curious expressions. Jekter's song ended with a note of pure triumph that seemed to resonate in Alina's bones long after the sound faded. The warrior guardian swayed on his feet, exhausted by the effort, but his eyes shone with joy as 3 small voices began chittering excitedly in their shared language. Alina tried to release the psychic connection gradually, but her overtaxed mind couldn't maintain the careful control needed. The link snapped like a broken cable, sending feedback through her nervous system that dropped her to her knees with a gasp of pain. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was Kekri struggling to sit up on her biobed, small hands reaching toward the human who had helped save her life. Alina woke 6 hours later in the station's human medical wing, her head feeling like it had been used as a percussion instrument. Dr. Martinez, the station's chief medical officer, was reviewing her charts with a frown. Neurological stress, severe psychic feedback, and what appears to be complete emotional exhaustion, Martinez muttered. I've never seen readings quite like these. The cubs, Alina's voice came out as a croak. Martinez's expression brightened. Fully recovered and driving the xenobiology team to distraction with their energy levels. Whatever you and that warrior did, it worked better than anything in our medical database. Alina tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as the room spun around her. Any leads on who poisoned them? Commander Torres has been conducting interviews. Preliminary results suggest it was Dr. Hendricks from the geology team. Apparently, he had strong opinions about the alliance with the Kithaerons and thought sabotaging it would be in humanity's best interest. The casual mention of attempted child murder made Alina's stomach turn. And now? Now he's in the brig and the Kithaeron delegation is calling for a formal trial under both human and Kithaeron law. But Alina, Martinez paused, his expression growing serious. There's something else you need to know. What you did in that medical bay, it's changed everything. Alina spent 3 days recovering before she was allowed to leave the medical wing. When she finally emerged, she found the entire station transformed in ways she couldn't have imagined. The first sign was the Kitharan delegation waiting outside her quarters. Not just Jector, but a full ceremonial guard of 12 warriors in formal regalia. They stood in perfect formation, their heads bowed in what Alina recognized as the traditional Kitharan gesture of profound respect. "Human friend Alina," Jector stepped forward, his voice carrying a formality she'd never heard before. "The Kitharan High Council requests the honor of your presence." Alina looked down at her simple station uniform, then back at the imposing warriors. "I'm not really dressed for a formal meeting." Jector's scarred face broke into what passed for a smile among his people. "You are dressed as the hero who saved our cubs. That is the only clothing that matters." The conference room had been transformed. Kitharan honor banners hung alongside human diplomatic flags, creating a visual representation of unity that took Alina's breath away. Around the table sat not just the station's leadership, but representatives from both species' highest levels of government. At the head of the table, a figure Alina had only seen in historical recordings rose to acknowledge her entrance. Elder Calmarin, the Kitharan High Counselor, was ancient even by his people's standards. His golden fur had long since turned silver, and ceremonial scars covered every inch of visible skin. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Human friend Alina," he began in careful English, "you have done something that our species thought impossible. You have proven that the barriers between minds are not absolute, that healing can transcend the boundaries of flesh and blood." Alina felt overwhelmed. "Elder Calmarin, I was just trying to help. I never intended." "Sit," the elder interrupted gently. "Let me tell you what you have accomplished." As Alina took her seat, Calmarin gestured to the holographic display that materialized above the table. It showed star charts spanning this entire sector of the galaxy, with hundreds of inhabited systems marked in different colors. "For 300 years, the elder continued, our people have believed that the deep singing was a gift unique to our species, a bond that could only exist between minds shaped by the same evolutionary pressures, the same cultural imperatives." The display zoomed in on a cluster of systems near the galactic rim. "But what you achieved in that medical bay has implications far beyond 3 small lives. You have proven that consciousness itself is more flexible, more universal than we ever imagined." Commander Torres leaned forward. "The preliminary reports are already generating excitement throughout the scientific community. If humans can participate in Kitharan healing practices, what other forms of interspecies cooperation might be possible?" Alina's mind reeled at the implications. "You're talking about changing the fundamental nature of how species interact." "We are talking about evolution," Elder Calmarin replied simply. "Not biological evolution, but something far more significant, the evolution of consciousness itself." The holographic display shifted, showing communication networks spanning vast distances, trade routes that connected dozens of species, collaborative research stations that had previously been thought impossible. "But more immediately," Jector interjected, his voice warm with affection, 3 cubs are alive who would otherwise have died, and they have claimed you as pack family." As if summoned by his words, the conference room doors opened to admit 3 small, golden forms. Kekri, Jalin, and Yilter bounded into the room with the irrepressible energy of healthy cubs, their chittering voices creating a cacophony of excitement. Alina found herself surrounded by warm fur and gentle claws as all 3 cubs tried to climb into her lap simultaneously. Their chittering resolved into broken English mixed with their native language, a stream of gratitude and affection that needed no translation. "We missed you," Kekri managed in careful English, her small hands gripping Alina's fingers. "When you were sleeping, we were worried." "You saved us," Jalin added, his usual curiosity about human customs replaced by simple, earnest gratitude. "Now we are family pack." Yilter, ever the most physical of the 3, simply pressed his head against Alina's shoulder and began to purr, a sound Alina had never heard from a Kitharan before, but which somehow conveyed more emotion than words ever could. Elder Calmarin watched this display with eyes that held centuries of wisdom. "Among our people, Alina, there is no greater honor than to be claimed as family by cubs who owe you their lives. But these 3 have done something unprecedented. They have claimed a human as pack family. He gestured to the assembled delegates. This council has voted unanimously to formalize what these cubs have declared. You are hereby recognized as the first human pack mother in Kitharan history. Alina felt tears streaming down her face as she looked around the room. At Commander Torres, whose stern demeanor had softened into something approaching paternal pride. At Dr. Harrison, whose scientific skepticism had given way to wonder. At the Kitharan delegates, whose formal bearing couldn't quite hide their emotional investment in this moment. And finally at Jector, whose golden eyes held a depth of gratitude and respect that transcended species barriers. There is one more thing, Elder Calmerin said quietly. The cubs have made a request that we cannot deny. Alina looked down at the three small faces watching her expectantly. What is it? They wish to stay with you, Jector explained. Not permanently, they will return to their birth clans for proper training when they come of age. But for now, they want their pack mother to raise them. Alina's breath caught. I'm not qualified to raise Kitharan cubs. I don't know your customs, your traditions. You know what matters most, Elder Calmerin interrupted. You know how to love them without reservation, how to sacrifice for their welfare, how to fight for their lives when all seems lost. He stood, his ancient frame commanding respect from every being in the room. That is what makes a true parent in any species. 3 months later, Alina's quarters had been expanded to accommodate her unusual family. She woke each morning to the sound of cubs practicing their pouncing techniques on the furniture, chittering arguments over who got to help with her research, and the occasional crash as Yilter's enthusiasm exceeded his coordination. Her reports had evolved from dry academic observations to something more personal, a record of daily life in the galaxy's first interspecies family unit. Scientists from dozens of worlds requested copies, not for the cultural data, but for the simple proof that consciousness could transcend the boundaries evolution seemed to impose. But Alina's greatest joy came in the quiet moments, when Kekri would curl up beside her while she worked, content to simply be near her pack mother. When Jalin would bring her strange flowers from the station's gardens, eager to share every discovery. When Yilter would demonstrate some new combat technique Jector had taught him, desperate for her approval. These cubs, who had faced death with courage beyond their years, had taught her something no academic study ever could. Love wasn't just an emotion. It was a force that could reshape reality itself, breaking down barriers that seemed absolute and creating connections that transcended every limit. She was neither soldier nor scientist, but she had become something more important, a bridge between worlds, a proof that the universe was vast enough for every kind of family. And when she looked into 3 pairs of trusting golden eyes each morning, Alina knew she had found her true purpose among the stars.